The war between Russia and Ukraine, which began on a large scale on February 24, 2022, with the Russian invasion of Ukrainian territory, represents one of the most significant conflicts on the European continent since the end of World War II, without a doubt the most transcendental at a geopolitical level since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. To understand the complexity of this confrontation, it is necessary to go back to historical, political, cultural, economic, military, and diplomatic factors, as well as the internal dynamics in both countries and the regional and global implications. Historical context and pre-conflict factors. The shared history and legacy of the Russian Empire and Russia and Ukraine maintain very deep historical, cultural, and linguistic ties dating back to Kiev Rus in the Middle Ages. Subsequently, for centuries, much of Ukrainian territory was part of the Russian Empire, later the Soviet Union, Ukraine's independence in 1991 after the collapse of the USSR. It was a traumatic event for more traditional Russian nationalism, since Ukraine is not only considered the historical cradle of East Slavic identity, but also its territory constituted a strategic region in geopolitical, industrial, and agricultural terms. The independence of Ukraine in 1991 and its path to the West after independence, Ukraine experienced decades marked by economic instability, government corruption, and alternation between more pro-Russian and more pro-Western governments, the so-called Orange Revolution 2004 and the Euromaidan protests of 2013-2014 marked a turning point. Euromaidan in particular meant the overthrow of then-President Viktor Yanukovych, perceived as very close to Moscow, and accelerated Kiev's turn towards the West. Russia considered these events as a threat to its interests and its sphere of influence, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the start of the conflict in Donbass in March 2014, following the change of government in Kiev. Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, a strategically important Ukrainian territory, due to its position on the Black Sea and the Sevastopol naval base. Although the Russian government argued the defense of the local Russian majority and the supposed danger of a nationalist government in Kiev, the international community condemned the annexation as a violation of international law in parallel in eastern Ukraine, in regions of Lenechki Lugansk. Collectively known as the Donbass, an armed conflict broke out between the Ukrainian army and pro-Russian separatist forces, supported more or less covertly by Moscow. Despite several ceasefire agreements and Minsk II agreements, the situation remained tense and unstable for years. NATO and the question of eastward enlargement, NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe, has been seen by Moscow as a direct threat to its security over the past few decades. Countries that were formerly part of the Warsaw Pact or even Baltic republics of the USSR joined the alliance. Ukraine's eventual accession to NATO was considered by Russia as an impassable red line. This geopolitical issue, added to the Ukrainian desire to join the European Union and strengthen ties with the West, was one of the main factors that led to an aggravation of the tensions, immediately triggering the large-scale conflict, the 2022 military buildup, and Russian ultimatums in the months leading up to February 2022. Russia began to accumulate troops and military equipment on its borders with Ukraine, including the territory of Belarus on the Crimean Peninsula. At the end of 2021, Moscow presented a series of security demands to the United States and NATO, among which was the guarantee that Ukraine would never join the alliance if it did not receive the required guarantees. The Kremlin interpreted the situation as a diplomatic failure and used this circumstance to justify the aggression. Official Russian speech on the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. The Russian president Putin justified the invasion by arguing that the Ukrainian government was controlled by Nazis and that it was necessary to free the country from these elements, in addition to preventing Ukraine from being a pawn of the West. These accusations were widely rejected by the international community and by the Ukrainian government itself, led by Volodymyr Zelensky, who comes from a family of Jewish origin and was democratically elected. Russian recognition of the People's Republics in the Donbass. Shortly before the invasion, Putin recognized the independence of the self-proclaimed Dean People's Republics. They distill separatist entities in the Donbass. This de facto broke the Minsk agreements. It served as a pretext for the military incursion under the assumption of defending these regions. Development of the war, the initial offensive and the Ukrainian resistance. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched simultaneous attacks from the north, including Belarusian territory, the east and the south. His goal seemed to be to quickly capture Kiev, overthrow the Ukrainian government, and establish a puppet regime favorable to Moscow. However, the resistance of the Ukrainian army, reinforced by Western logistical and intelligence support, surprised Russian forces within weeks. The Russian offensive on the capital stalled, and Russian troops had to withdraw from the Kiev region to concentrate in eastern and southern Ukraine. The war of positions on the Don goes and the south as the war progressed. The theater of operations focused mainly on the Donbass, as well as the southern provinces, including the strategic city of Mariupol in 2022, whose capture by Russia was symbolic and strategic due to its coastal position in the Assa Sea. However, the war became a conflict of attrition, with intense fighting, heavy artillery, aerial bombardment, and the use of drones. The Ukrainian counteroffensive from 2022 to 2023, as the months passed, the Ukrainian armed forces. Strengthened by the constant supply of Western weapons and state-of-the-art tanks, anti-aircraft systems, later increasingly advanced weapons, they began to launch successful counteroffensives in some sectors, recovering territory in the northeast, in the Yarko region and later in the south, particularly around Kherson, a key city that was reconquered by Ukraine in November 2022. These counteroffensives not only surprised international public opinion, but led Russia to announce a partial mobilization of its forces. Seen in September 2022, something unprecedented since World War II, this measure was seen as a recognition that the initial military campaign had not achieved the expected results. The growing internationalization of the conflict, the war in Ukraine is not limited to a regional confrontation. It has global implications affecting Europe's energy security, world cereal supplies. Ukraine and Russia are large exporters of wheat, corn and sunflower oil, economic stability, power relations between the West, Russia, China, and other emerging powers, as well as the international legal framework based on the Charter of the United Nations. Economic sanctions on Russia. After the start of the invasion, the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and other countries imposed unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions affected banking, technology exports, Russian central bank reserves, elites close to the Kremlin, and the energy sector. The objective was to weaken the Russian ability to finance the war and pressure Moscow to negotiate energy dependence. That there are readjustments in Europe, Europe was largely dependent on Russian gas and oil before the war.